Hello, I'm the Reverend Jennifer Brower, one of the ministers who serves the Unitarian Universalist congregation at Shelter Rock. On behalf of my colleagues on the ministry team, the Reverend Dr. Natalie Fenimore and the Reverend Jay Brooks, as well as the members of our congregation and the staff members engaged in the creation and delivery of this program, it is my privilege to welcome you to this virtual commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In 1945, on August 6th and August 9th, the United States, with the consent of the United Kingdom, dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, instantly killing tens of thousands of people of all ages in the blasts and firestorms. Tens of thousands more would die from radiation poisoning and delayed effects in the days after. Today's virtual gathering, marking the 75th anniversary of this stunning act of violence, serves to keep before us our history so that we will never forget what extremes we are capable of. This event also creates and offers for us the sacred space to join together in reflection and contemplation and mourning, even after all these years. From this time spent together, may we be reminded of the power and potential within humankind for good as well as depravity. May this time together encourage us to use our life energy to build a world with more justice and mercy and compassion in it. Let us finally bring to an end the development of nuclear weapons and other methods of mass destruction. On behalf of all of those who have sponsored this event and who have lent their time and energy to its creation, I invite you now to create for yourself some comfortable space and be here with us all for this deeply meaningful time of remembrance. Thank you for joining us today.
"75 years ago today, at 8:15 a.m. in Hiroshima, the United States dropped the first atomic bomb, killing thousands of people instantly, and many more from the resulting radiation poisoning, acid rain, and other fallout. 3 days later, at 11:02 a.m. in Nagasaki, we dropped the second bomb, where thousands more suffered a horrific instant death. One does not have to visit Hiroshima or Nagasaki to see the absolute devastation these bombs caused and to mourn the over 215,000 people who were killed in the name of US imperialism. Nor do you need to visit to sympathize with the over 170,000 Hibakusha who still suffer to this day. But I have been fortunate enough to visit both Hiroshima and Nagasaki last year to hear Hibakusha share their stories and to visit the Hiroshima Memorial Peace Museum. In US history books, or at least what I was taught when I was in school, was that these bombings were necessary to end the war, that many more American lives would have been lost had we not dropped the bombs. But we know this now to be a lie. Japan was considering surrender before either bomb had been dropped, and it's no accident that the US chose Hiroshima to test out the first atomic weapon in combat, the second ever detonated. Hiroshima was a military base, sure, but it was also in a relatively flat area, perfect for seeing how far-reaching the effects of this new weapon would be. The citizens of Hiroshima were used as guinea pigs in the same way that the US has regularly tested on and abused the bodies of indigenous peoples, enslaved and free Black people, and other people of color around the globe. It's not an accident that we dropped these bombs on Japan and not Italy or Germany. It's not coincidence that Japanese people in the US were forced into internment camps when Italian and German people in the US were not. This is not to say that there wasn't animosity towards Italian and German people in the US at the time, but to say that some people could assimilate to whiteness for safety, and some could clearly not. In every level of development of nuclear bombs, it has harmed and killed Black, Indigenous, and people of color. From uranium mining on indigenous soil to the bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to the nuclear testing carried out in the Marshall Islands, these toxic weapons have poisoned and killed countless people in the name of US imperialism and white supremacist empire. Even today, not only are we still poisoning indigenous lands with nuclear waste and refusing to apologize to the Hibakusha and victims of nuclear testing, but we're also robbing our own nation of domestic programs, resources, and infrastructure to instead spend trillions of dollars to modernize our nuclear arsenal. We have a president who has not only pulled out of some of the most significant arms control treaties, but who is threatening to resume nuclear testing and has used fire and fury rhetoric to threaten the people of North Korea. I cannot think of a bigger insult to the Hibakusha and to the memory of those who died at the hands of these horrific weapons than to continue to pour trillions of dollars into these weapons and to ponder aloud why we have these weapons if we can't use them. The Hibakusha have a clear mission to abolish these weapons in their lifetime, and with the average age of the Hibakusha now in their late 80s, we are running out of time to fulfill their life's mission. Despite the total lack of US government cooperation, or any nuclear weapon state for that matter, in July 2017, 122 nations voted to adopt the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or TPNW. To be in the room for this historic moment was something that I will never forget. It was a bright moment of hope on an issue that sometimes feels insurmountable. The tide is turning. The vast majority of people in the world want to see nuclear weapons abolished. The international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, ICAN, won the Nobel Peace Prize that year, further signaling the global desire to abolish these weapons. Today, 40 countries have ratified the TPNW, meaning that just 10 more countries must ratify before this treaty enters into force and becomes international law. The US has, of course, broken international law before, but this at least shows that what the US and other nuclear-armed states are doing is out of step with the rest of the world, and that stigma will only increase as the TPNW continues to gain traction. I think that now, especially during this COVID-19 pandemic and resulting economic crisis, it's become clear that we must reevaluate what keeps us safe. How absolutely shameful for the US to plan to spend $1.7 trillion updating our nuclear arsenal over the next 30 years, when right now we can't even afford adequate tests, personal protective equipment, ventilators, or sufficient pay to our essential workers to help combat a global pandemic. When we can only offer a one-time $1,200 check to US citizens, when a record number of people have lost their jobs and cannot pay their mortgages or rent. That President Trump is even requesting more funds to develop new weapons, including more low-yield nuclear weapons, the size of which are similar to the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, is outrageous. A bomb that causes the absolute devastation seen in Hiroshima is by no means a strategic or more usable weapon. We should not be using nuclear weapons again ever, of any size, period. In the 75 years since the bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we've seen a lot of suffering and turmoil continue in the world. In this time in the US, we've had Jim Crow laws, US imperial wars in Korea and Vietnam, and we've continued to have lynchings, instances of police brutality and extrajudicial murder by the police, post-9/11 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and countless other unauthorized wars where US military operations are being carried out. We've seen violence and discrimination against the LGBTQ community, especially our Black trans sisters, who are still disproportionately murdered. We've seen the disregard for Indigenous land treaties across the US and increased devastation of the environment. We've also seen a lot of resistance, and a lot of people standing up for peace and justice across the globe. We've had the emergence of and resurgence of the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the LGBTQ rights movement, the disability justice movement, the anti-apartheid movement, the anti-nuclear movement, the environmental justice movement, the Black Lives Matter justice movement, and countless others. I may have only been alive for 25 of these past 75 years, but I think the arc will ultimately bend towards justice. Not just because it's what's right, but because it's the only way that we'll all survive. We do what we can because we must, and none of us are free until we're all free. Thank you.
The renowned Japanese poet Yorifumi Yaguchi was a child during the Second World War. He was a child when the bombs fell on Hiroshima. This is his poem, A Shadow or Hiroshima. Look at this stone step. Look at this shadow, man-shaped, printed on this stone. Someone was resting here in the shape of the thinking man of Rodin. And perhaps he was thinking deep, something else, tired out by war, and was resting at 8:15 a.m. on August 6th, 1945. Now here only his shadow is left exactly in his shape. It is left here as the image left in our heart, which will never, never die out. Yorifumi Yaguchi, the shadow.
It's time we as Long Islanders, New Yorkers, and peace activists as a whole take action. We should call on our legislators to make statements supporting international arms control agreements, including the Iran nuclear agreement, the New START Treaty, and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Abandoning nuclear weapons treaties creates instability and increases the risk of a new nuclear arms race, as well as the spread of these nuclear weapons. As Emily said before, the United Nations Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons has the support of a majority of the world's nations. The United States should support this treaty and take steps in coordination with other nuclear arms nations to come into compliance with it. We should ask our lawmakers to pressure the current administration to support this treaty. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, commonly known as the Iran Nuclear Agreement, is the best way to block all of Iran's potential pathways to a nuclear bomb. Over 50 retired generals and diplomats called for the U.S. to re-enter the agreement, and we should support these generals and diplomats by calling for our lawmakers to make statements on re-entering this crucial agreement. Among the risks the world faces, the U.S. and Russia possess 90% of the world's 14,000 nuclear warheads. The New START Treaty limits the number of deployed strategic nuclear weapons Russia and the U.S. can have, and gives the U.S. access to Russia's nuclear program. The current administration should work with Russia to renew this critical treaty before it expires in 2021. We should call on our representatives to co-sponsor the Prevention of Arms Race Act, S-845 or H.R. 1231, calling for the extension of this vital New START treaty. Again, that's the Prevention of Arms Race Act, S-845 or H.R. 1231, that calls for the extension of this vital New START treaty. Finally, nuclear warfare is one of the two existential crises humanity faces today, the other being climate change. It is estimated that in the next 30 years, there will be $1.7 trillion spent on nuclear weapons. This money could be used to address real security threats, like the coronavirus pandemic or climate change, or even towards supporting critical human needs like healthcare, housing, unemployment programs for the over 40 million newly unemployed, education, and so much more. Congress should increase investments in programs that can reduce the nuclear threat, such as non-proliferation programs and the State Department, instead of spending taxpayer dollars on new nuclear weapons that increase the threat of a nuclear war. A nation's budget is supposed to reflect a nation's priorities. I know that I wouldn't want that $1.7 trillion going towards nuclear weapons. Would you? We should call on our representatives to co-sponsor the Smarter Approaches to Nuclear Expenditures Act, S-2727 or H.R. 4904, to reduce this tremendous and wasteful nuclear weapons spending. Again, that's the same act that calls for reducing this tremendous and wasteful nuclear weapon spending as 2727 or H.R. 4904. 75 years ago, tens of thousands of people died after the US dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the first and only use of nuclear weapons in war. We need to do our part to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone ever again. Thank you.
We who believe in freedom cannot free rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Until the killing of black men, black mothers' sons, is as important as the killing of white men, white mothers' sons. We who believe in freedom again and freedom at rest. We who believe in freedom again and freedom cannot rest. To me, young people come first. They have the courage where we failed. And if I can but shed some light as they carry us through the gale. The older I get, the better I know that the secret of my going on is when the reins are in the hands of the young who dare to run against the storm. We who believe in freedom and freedom at rest. We who believe in freedom and freedom cannot rest. Not needing to clutch for power, not needing the light just to shine on me. I'm gonna be one in the number as we stand against tyranny. Struggling myself, don't need a whole lot. I've come to realize that teaching others to stand up and fight is the only way our struggle survives. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. I'm a woman who speaks in a voice, and I must be heard. At times I can be quite difficult. I'll bow to no man's word. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it rests.
I'm Margaret Melconi, and I'm the director of the Long Island Alliance for Peaceful Alternatives. We come together to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the U.S. atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We come to mourn the lives lost. We come to mourn all the lives lost to war, violence, and poverty. We recognize that all whom we love and all that we care about could be lost in an instant. The bomb that fell on Hiroshima came down 6 miles in 43 seconds. A city was obliterated and tens of thousands of people were killed. We come together to remember the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as he warned us that a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense, billions, than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. He spoke to us about the triplets of evil. So we are here to recommit ourselves to the work for peace and nonviolence. And we say to the world, and we say to Congress, and we say to each other, it is time. It is time to ban nuclear weapons. It is time to end militarism, racism, and poverty. It is time to act to save people from pandemics, from war, and from global climate change. It is time to choose love and to love one another. So as we come to a close, see the graphics with the New York senators and the representatives, and call them and urge them to get the United States to sign the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and tell them to vote to cut military spending and to use instead the billions we're spending on nuclear weapons to invest in our communities, in education, in healthcare, jobs, and restoring the environment. Please see the graphics at the end that will tell you how to get more information and to get involved with organizations working to end war, militarism, racism, and poverty. And finally, in November, vote. Vote for peace. Vote. Be a peace voter. All our lives depend on it. Thank you.